Okay, brilliant. Let's get started. John, if you could keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in, that would be great. Hi everyone, great to see you here. Today, AFA's webinar today is looking at state apprenticeship tax credits. Um, I'm just gonna do a little bit of housekeeping and a bit of an introduction up front before we get into it. Firstly, just a quick housekeeping. As always, we're recording this. We'll share the recording and the slides after the presentation, so no need to take notes. Format wise, we're going to give a bit of an overview, first 10 minutes, just what's the lay of the land, what's going on at the state level, federally. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with our friends who we'll introduce later on from the States. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So if you've got any questions as we're going along, either just put them in the sidebar and we'll try and get to them, or you can put your hand up at the end. Cool. Just by means of a bit of introduction, I wanted to set out a little bit about why we're talking about state tax credits right now. Firstly, one reason there's a lot going on and it's a pretty complicated landscape, as you'll see. There's lots of states doing different things, different approaches, different setups. So, we as AFA wanted to, look across that landscape, set out a little bit about what's going on. I don't think we've got a kind of particularly scientific grip of like we're quite early in many of these credits, so I don't think we have a particularly scientific grip of like what's really effective or not, what's not. So that's why I'm really pleased to kind of bring this panel together to talk about, just on a practical human level, what's worked, what's been a good way of implementing tax credits and what's not. And then the second reason why this is a relevant discussion now is there's quite a lot of federal attention on tax credits. There's a big apprenticeship federal tax credit bill in the works in Congress right now. But tax credits have got quite a mixed record in apprenticeship. We want to make sure that we're having this conversation, grounded in the experience of what's going on. Um, cool. John, if you could get the slides up, please, that would be great. Okay, great. So yeah, we're just going to give a quick kind of overview of what the state of play is. Starting with the slide two. Um, so we know we've got at least 16 states right now that have got an apprenticeship specific tax credit. This jumps up and down quite a bit, as we'll hear from our panel later. Some have recently, let the tax credits expire. Some of them have introduced new states. We're going to hear from those. Um, on top of these 16, there's a couple of states that have, a broader workforce development tax credit or retraining tax credit that can maybe used for apprenticeship. So this is a kind of like de minimis amount rather than the maximum. Um, Skipping ahead to the next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because that'd be a pretty boring way to spend 20 minutes. But we've compiled a list of, all of the kind of current state of play of credits. We'll send these around post webinar. We've also put together a one pager that details this and a few of the kind of key design choices that we see. Um, I wanted to pull out a couple of points to note off, in general about the approach that people are taking. Broadly, we see three different approaches that states are taking and how they design their tax credit. There's the kind of general per apprentice credit, that's sort of the cleanest. You can see many of these. There's just Illinois 3,500 per apprentice. It's kind of the simplest approach. We've also seen quite a few states take industry specific approach where they're trying to incentivize or grow apprenticeships in specific industries. We're going to hear from Colorado later that's using their credit, on the kind of new and emerging industries rather than the less established, the more established ones. So yeah, you can see the thinking and idea there. And then we also have some states. If we skip ahead to the next slide, we have some states that take a population specific view. So they have a credit that is targeted on getting particular populations into apprenticeship. So, New York has specific payments for disadvantaged youth. Um, a few other reflections on these. There are often quite low limits on, the kind of aggregate exposure on these tax credits or the per employer level. So, obviously you need, fiscal safeguards. These are demand-led credits. You need a way to control that expenditure. I think we see, at the state level, you can see Missouri here is capped at 9,000 per employer, 1 million annual cap across the whole state. It's not, if you added up all of these incentives, we're not talking about a huge amount of money that's currently on the table due to those caps. Um, we also, if you look across all of these, we have wildly different per apprentice amounts. So we're going to hear from some of the larger states with the larger credits today in South Carolina and Colorado. So it'll be interesting to hear on the reflections about, whether that matters. And then there's a few specific design features that we're going to get into later. So, South Carolina, if we skip to the next slide, have got features built into their credit. There's a retention and completion bonus, and there's a few states that allow, allow you to roll over an unused credits. There's lots of kind of interesting design features that we'll get into in the discussion. Um, and then if we could go ahead to the next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today. We're going to concentrate on the design of credits that are specifically for apprenticeship, but just to note that there are a lot of, wider tax regimes and incentives that can apply to apprenticeship. We pulled out a few of these here, but I think there's probably a lot more examples of these across the country. So California's got a kind of general business incentivization program, Cal Competes. Part of the kind of um, process here takes workforce development into account. So, in a way that can include apprenticeships. And then Mississippi, Ohio, Virginia all have credits that cover some of the costs for employers who are training their employees, either, in terms of a wage subsidy or all covering the cost of classroom training. So again, those are kind of other credits that could cover apprenticeship, not necessarily designed for them. Um, Going on to the next slide, I just want to touch a bit on what's going on at the federal level at the moment. So the current state of play, what's currently on the table, there is no sort of, focused apprenticeship tax credit at the federal level. But there are two programs that do kind of apply to apprenticeship that are currently active. The first that I'm sure a lot of people in this room have got experience of is the Inflation Reduction Act credits. So the way that this works is for apprenticeship, there's a multiplier effect. The credit that you get is 5 times bigger if you meet, various requirements for employing apprentices and various requirements for prevailing wages. So I think the figures are you get a 6% tax credit without employing apprentices. With employing them and paying prevailing wages, you get 30%. So it's pretty significant. There were some revisions to that recently under the Trump administration. The number of eligible projects has declined, but what's interesting is they kept the apprenticeship parts. We haven't seen data on, how this is been used for apprenticeship. It would be very interesting if it's out there. Anecdotally, we've heard it's been quite complex to access for companies that are employing apprentices. And then the second work opportunity tax credit, as with the last slide on state credits, this isn't exclusively for apprenticeship, but if you're hiring certain populations as apprentices, this can work as well. And then what's on the table? So there's two bills currently in play that would introduce an apprenticeship tax credit at this federal level. The big one is the Wages Act. This will be really big. So, it covers 50% of wages up to 5,000 a quarter, so 20,000 a year, and also covers some program expenses. In a tax credit. So it's introduced by Senator Young and Representative Moran in the House. There's an important provision there that it's refundable. So even if you don't have a tax liability, you can get that money back as a refund. So this could be a really, pretty major source of funding. Right now it's in committee. It hasn't advanced. I'm not sure. I don't think the chances of it advancing in its current form on its own are too high. But it's very interesting that there's such a significant bill. And then the second is the Skill Act. This one's broader than apprenticeship, but applies. So, this will give employers a 2,500 credit for every student that completes various training programs, including an apprenticeship, an additional 2,500 if they hire it. This has just been introduced. It's pretty new, so we're not really sure where that's going to go. Um, if we could go ahead to the next slide, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on internationally on using tax to encourage incentivize apprenticeships. It's safe to say it's pretty unusual to use tax credits to incentivize apprenticeship internationally. Like the US is probably an outlier already in how much it's using the tax code here. Canada's the only other kind of major industrialized country that's using tax credits on a major scale. Lots of other countries use tax, but it's actually the normal approach is like more as a negative incentive rather than kind of a positive credit. So England and France and a few other countries have an apprenticeship levy that basically works in a use it or lose it way. And employers taxed, they can only reclaim that money if they hire apprentices. Um, and England, we had some tax credits, or tax exemptions for specific apprentices. We actually found out they had very little impact, but that's in a situation where you've got a lot more grant funding for apprenticeship up front. So yeah, it's a different landscape. And then looking at other countries, Germany and Switzerland don't have any kind of tax incentives for employers. In fact, they don't really have grant incentives either. They cover a lot of they cover the cost of the vocational training, but they don't really incentivize employers. Instead, they have, this whole system of employers being bought in, convinced of the business case, committed to building a talent pipeline. Um, the one we picked up here is Australia. Australia has some small tax exemptions, but they really incentivize employers through grants. They have direct per apprentice grants. You get the money up front rather than going through the tax system. So yeah, all of these countries are kind of peers in apprenticeship, not really using tax or tax credits in the same way, but it's safe to say they all put far more grant funding up front in. So the whole equation is quite different. Um, Brilliant. That is everything that we are going to cover up front as a bit of a landscape scan of what's going on. So next we're gonna get on to our panel. So really pleased today to have our friends from Alabama, South Carolina, and Colorado together with us. Um, I am gonna, sorry, let me just bring you up. Um, so yeah, can I get you to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what your state is doing on tax credits for apprenticeship? Meredith, can I start with you?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Meredith Smith. I'm the director of the Alabama Office of Apprenticeship. When our office was created back in 2019, we had tax credits, and there was an additional tax credit if the employer hired an in-school youth into their apprenticeship. Back in 2022, we changed to incentive funding. So we do wage reimbursement, and the tax credit ended last year. So we'll get into the details of that a little bit more today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Meredith. Tracy.
Yes, hi, I'm Tracy Brookover with Apprenticeship Colorado, housed under the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. And this is our first year, now our second year of our tax credit, which is, as you saw, up to $15 million a year that's available for these tax credits. So this is we are really in the thick of it at this point with the tax year of 2025 being completed. So learned a lot of lessons, and I'm excited to chat a little bit more about our program with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I'm very happy to have you here as the newest addition to the state tax credits.
Yeah.
Um, Amanda, can I come to you next? Can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you guys are doing on tax credits?
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Richardson, and I have the honor of serving as the Vice President for Apprenticeship Carolina in South Carolina. We are a division of the South Carolina Technical College System, and our team of 17 helps organizations to develop, implement, and maximize registered youth and adult apprenticeship programs, as well as certified pre-apprenticeship programs in the state of South Carolina. And our state apprenticeship income tax credit was originally enacted in 2007 at the same time that Apprenticeship Carolina was formed. And the credit was set at a standard $1,000 per apprentice per year of the apprenticeship program, so a cap of 4 years. And the legislation was amended in May of 2024 to increase that cap to $4,000 per year for apprentices 25 and over, and $6,000 per year for youth apprentices. The amendment also added a $1,000 retention credit for up to 3 years after the apprentice completes their program.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amanda. So we've got a mix here of the newest state, one of the most long-standing, and then Meredith, who's just moved from tax to grants and completely changed the program. So I think we're gonna learn a lot from the mix of experience here. Um, I want to start with a question about, this is tax credits look really good on paper. I'm sure we have a lot of our governors talking about tax credits. It's the most popular strategy for states to grow apprenticeship, as we've seen. There's a lot of states doing it. But we often hear that, there's a lot of money being left on the table. Businesses just don't claim the credits. So I would love to get your perspective on what's going on here. Is this about design choices? Why are businesses not claiming some of the credits? Amanda, can I start with you?
Sure. So we do see that in South Carolina, and to be honest, we're still working to figure out exactly why. There are a lot of factors that play into whether companies capitalize on these credits, such as awareness, their level of tax liability, and whether the investment is worth the monetary value that they're going to receive in return. And our inclination was that simply the juice wasn't worth the squeeze at $1,000 per apprentice per year, which is why we advocated for that tax credit increase. Traditionally, no more than 4% of our apprenticeship sponsors claim these tax credits on their eligible employees. There's a $5 million annual cap in South Carolina on this tax credit, but to be honest, claims have never reached the $2 million mark in a single year to this point. But our expectation is that the increase in the caps per apprentice, along with the addition of the retention credit, will make it more worthwhile for the employers, and that we will start seeing the annual credits dramatically increase as a result of that.
Thanks, Amanda. So to paraphrase, basically too little money. Now you've increased your credit. You're hoping that's going to change. Um, Meredith, can I come to you on this? So you've obviously just stopped your tax credit, changed it to reimbursement funding. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that. You know, why you stopped it, what the experience with employers was, and then how the change is going.
Sure. The tax burden here in Alabama is relatively low. And you know, you mentioned earlier the tax credit you were talking about being refundable. Ours was written in law as non-refundable. And a lot of times our businesses, you know, as part of an economic development incentive package, they don't have to pay state tax, or maybe the sponsor might be a nonprofit. We just really found that that our tax credit was not being utilized at maximum capacity. So I crunched the numbers this morning. In the 6 years that we had the tax credit, I ran the totals there, and then in the 2.5 years we've been doing the wage reimbursement, we've given out the same amount of money than we did 6 years of tax credit. So it is being much more widely used. One distinction is with the tax credit, anybody who had an apprenticeship could apply for that, but our incentive funding is only for expansion. So it's new programs, or if a program adds a new occupation, and a program's considered new for 3 years. So there were a few employers who were not happy about that because they were eligible for the tax credit, but they're not eligible for the incentive funding unless they add an occupation.
That's very interesting. So it's early days, but it sounds like the switch to a reimbursement model has made a really big difference, you know, partly because lots of your employers just didn't have the liability for the tax credit to matter. Um, and then Tracy, I'm going to come to you. Obviously, your credit's really new, so you know you haven't got as much experience in implementation. But I'd love to hear a bit about how you thought through this, you know, with the design, how you thought, you know, how do we make this really appeal to employers?
Yeah, I think for Colorado, we really wanted, it was a initiative through Governor Polis to make sure that we are increasing our apprenticeships through this tax credit. And so with our unique tax structure in Colorado, it is a refundable tax credit. And so tax credits are subtracted from our revenue prior to refunds being given. So that is something that is really amazing for our employers. And so we do have a maximum of $12,600 per apprentice per tax year, and they can claim the same apprentice for 2 years. And so for us, I think it's we've done a lot of work and process and making our relationships work and getting the word out there. But I think that for us, it's difficult so far because of the first year, and there's extensions being filed with taxes, so we don't have that full data just yet. However, I think that is something to consider, is making sure that we have a good plan of getting the word out there. It's an amazing opportunity. So I think it's really just giving that knowledge to those smaller employers. And so one of the items I do want to mention is that it is geared towards our new and emerging industries, which is, the list is quite extensive of employers that can utilize this credit for registered apprenticeships. So I think we'll see more. If there's an increase, hopefully there will be an increase, because we're doing a lot of work on the back end. So it's a little bit difficult to say so far if the reasoning why employers are leaving some money on the table.
Thanks, Tracy. And I wanna pick up on something you said there about kind of designing the process and making it smooth. I think we had a comment in the chat, basically saying this is too complicated, too much work for too little money. We often hear that the kind of process, paperwork burden can put businesses off, deter them from claiming the credits. Often you're dealing with a different agency, different part of government, that kind of stuff. So I'd love to hear a bit about, you've just designed this process for the largest tax credit. How did you think through sort of balancing the need for protecting public money, for integrity, with also making it as smooth and as simple as you could, for businesses trying to claim it?
Yeah, I can't express to you enough the importance of having good relationships with your Department of Revenue, with your entire team at Apprenticeship Colorado, within everyone who is doing anything in terms of registered apprenticeships. It's so important to have those relationships and to get that feedback. And with that, I think one of the things that is very helpful in our design is that most of the paperwork burden is on us at this point, actually, and really making sure that our employers have it very seamless, a seamless application. There's a reservation, you reserve your money. Then once it's reserved, you have our tax credit certificate application that you do that is very minimal in information because we've already gathered information at the first part. And I also think it's worth noting that we utilize Rapids for all of our apprenticeship information. And so we cross-reference within our database, and that's also getting sponsors aligned with employers. And it's been a really robust system on the back end for us, and hopefully not too much of a burden for our employers.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tracy. Amanda, interested in your reflections about how this works in South Carolina. Is it a smooth process, especially with there's been some chat in the chat about how this works in an OA state?
Yes, absolutely. There are some similarities and then also some differences with how we're set up compared to what Meredith was just, I'm sorry, what Tracy was just describing in Colorado. But it is definitely a balancing act for us in South Carolina, because that entire process for claiming the tax credit is handled completely through our State Department of Revenue. And they are the ones responsible for creating the forms that align with the legislative requirements. But their staff is very limited in their knowledge of registered apprenticeships. So I will certainly second Tracy's comment that relationship is very important and critical to having a seamless process for everyone, including the employers. For example, from a state paperwork standpoint, when our legislation was amended in May of 24, the tax form required for employers essentially went from a single page with about 5 simple questions to 12 questions plus 3 different worksheets that required more detailed information on each of the apprentices that the company is claiming. 1 worksheet for adult apprentices, 1 worksheet for youth apprentices, and 1 worksheet for the completed apprentices. And that's primarily because each of these classifications is set in legislation at a different credit cap per apprentice. With that, our staff is very limited in the level of technical assistance and guidance that we're able to provide, since obviously we're not going to be perceived as giving out tax advice to these companies, and because our organization is so far removed from the process. And so that's certainly a place that we see lots of opportunity in South Carolina, and are currently working with our Department of Revenue to improve that relationship between these 2 agencies, to gain better understanding so that we can provide better guidance to companies and ensure that we are aligned with their efforts there as well. And we're hopeful that this will also open the door for better data sharing in the future, because currently we're unable to receive anything beyond the number of claims that come in and the total amount that's credited each fiscal year. And to be honest, we receive that information once the Department of Revenue's annual report is finalized and it goes public for everyone. So still working on that here in South Carolina for sure, but working to make sure that we can have that process as seamless as possible for both agencies and particularly for the employers.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm taking from both of you there that there is a lot of complexity in how these processes work, but yeah, partnership across agencies is a really important way to try and reduce that. Meredith, would love to hear about your experiences of the process here, perhaps, both with your previous tax credit and then now with your reimbursement process, how you've been able to think about that to make it easier for employers.
We have just really been very intentional in trying to keep that process as simple as possible. We want the juice to be worth the squeeze, right? Our tax credit application, it was just front and back, one page, and it was a very, very simple process. With our incentives, we actually created a new position, and we have one person whose primary responsibility is handling the incentives and then tracking data about the incentives. And it's I think the contract is maybe 4 pages, and then there's just a spreadsheet. She does, like Tracy said, she is doing all the heavy lifting that she possibly can because we don't want to create any extra work for our employers. So we just usually schedule a meeting, go over our policies and procedures, and then she works with them to get the information and completes the paperwork herself. Really, they're just signing on the dotted line.
Brilliant. So you've designed it as simply as you possibly can in
Yes.
this next iteration. Brilliant. I want to talk a bit now about you know, is this working? So I don't think we really have kind of comprehensive, evaluations, outcomes, as you've all indicated. The data's quite tricky here, so I don't think we've really got a good sense about, overall our tax credits working, or the effect, the impact of the incentivization. But I would love to hear, a bit more anecdotally from you about how you feel it's working. Are these arrangements really are they getting new employers involved in apprenticeship? Are they helping to scale existing programs? Or is this, a way of people like already in the game covering their costs? Meredith, you sort of talked about it a little bit earlier, but I wonder if you could expand a bit on, how this move to a reimbursement model has changed the dial. What kind of employers you're seeing coming in asking about that compared to what used to happen?
Well, we want to make sure, an apprenticeship is an employer's investment in their talent, and we want to make sure that people are signing up for the right reasons. But a lot of times, if an employer is kind of on the fence, they're not really sure about that ROI that they're going to see. I do think, this helps mitigate that perception that maybe they wouldn't see the ROI. That they're hoping to see. When you were asking the question, I thought about one of our hospitals. They are really participating with the incentives and adding lots of occupations. They started with our nursing, and now they've added paramedic and coders and plumbers and electricians. I really do think it got them in the door, and now they realize how much they love apprenticeship, and they really value being able to grow their own talent. So yeah, I do think it really helps with employers who might be on the fence.
That's a really good point. That was my experience in the UK as well when we did some similar kind of grant incentives. It wasn't necessarily the actual cash. It was this got people interested, got them in the door, and then they figured out they could make this sustainable. Um, Amanda, I'd love to hear a little bit, sort of, anecdotally recent experience about how the recent changes, the increase in the size, the retention bonus, how that's gone down in South Carolina, what you're hearing from employers.
Yeah, so of course, the full scale of the increase's impact remains to be seen, but it certainly is making a positive difference here in South Carolina. This show of the state's support for business and talent development in the state is getting new employers interested in learning more about registered apprenticeships and encouraging existing employers to expand and claim credits that they may have been leaving on the table in the past. We have noticed an increase in employer engagement, particularly from smaller businesses, as a result of the increase, and can at least partly attribute the success of this year to that, because our consultant team helped to register 192 new occupations this past fiscal year. We did see an uptick in the tax credit claims for the 2024-2025 fiscal year, which was the first full fiscal year with the higher rates. But numbers really were only slightly up from the 4 prior fiscal years. The data for 25-26 will not be released until sometime next spring. So I think we'll have a better idea at that point, but do expect the trend to be a continual increase.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amanda. And then Tracy, this is obviously very new for you as well, so it's less easy to tell if it's working, with the data. But I'd be really interested to hear how you're thinking about measuring if this is working, how you're tracking it, how will you know if this works?
Yeah, I think one of the things we have recently implemented and maybe something that I think maybe we wanted to do in the beginning but didn't, is that tracking of how these employers are expanding or growing their new programs. And so in our application, it's a simple question. Are you expanding your program or registering your program as a result of the tax credit? Because just like Meredith said, we want to make sure that they are getting into it for the right reasons and that they are really wanting to have these apprentices and grow their talent pipeline in a way that makes sense for them, not just monetarily. So that's something that we take pretty serious at Apprenticeship Colorado, and making sure that we are utilizing those funds properly. So I'm excited to see how that one question is going to help us track our information and new programs. But as you all know, it just takes some time to get those new programs started, and really tying it back to the specific tax credit is something that we hope to do.
Brilliant. That is good to hear. So you want to be able to actually measure the additionality, who exactly, got into this off the back of the tax credit.
Yes.
And then I want to expand. I think this has come up a little bit, but how do you get the word out about this? How do you communicate to employers who might not know, either that much about apprenticeship or about the tax credit, about what's available? Anyone can jump in about what you do on the kind of marketing side.
Yeah, I'll just speak from South Carolina. Anytime that we present on the benefits of registered apprenticeship, we always mention the tax credit. The level of detail that we go into with that depends on our audience, but it is integrated into our standard slide deck. As mentioned previously, that partnership with our State Department of Revenue is critically important, as is the partnerships, as Meredith mentioned, with other organizations that are working with new and existing businesses within the state, like local, regional, and state economic development entities, as well as industry associations. Those folks are typically talking with businesses every day about available financial incentives. So it's important that they are also aware of the apprenticeship tax credit that can be stacked with any of the other ones.
Yeah, we work really closely with our economic developers so that we make sure when they're having those site selection visits and things like that, that it's something that they can mention. Whenever we do a presentation, we typically mention it. When we are meeting with an employer, though, it's not the thing that we lead with. back to my comment earlier, it's typically later in the process. You know, we're asking what their pain points are, we're building out the training plan, and then we do what we call our coupon hunting. We talk to them about all the resources that are out there that can help them offset the cost of the training, including our incentive dollars, but we don't typically lead with it.
Yeah, similar with us in Colorado, we have our RAP 101 orientation, our presentation slide deck for any potentially interested individuals and employers that are wanting to start a program. And we work pretty closely with our Colorado recognized qualified apprenticeship intermediaries as well to help us spread the word. We've utilized just marketing material, rack cards sent to all of the local workforce centers within the state. And speaking at various events, our Colorado Business Roundtable event, where we have many employers that are represented there, we were able to get the word out there. So I think that's one of the things that we are really strategizing on our end a little bit more this year, now that we have our process in place, is figuring out really how to get that word out. So I've heard some wonderful things from you, Meredith and Amanda. So hopefully we can implement some of those here in Colorado as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I think to bring that together, it's fair to say you're not necessarily using these incentives as like the big marketing push on apprenticeship. It's more a slightly like supplemental thing. I want to ask one more question before I open this up and start to pick up things in the chat and bring in the audience. Which is, what would your advice be to a state that's thinking about implementing a new tax credit, designing this from the ground up? Yeah, what would your advice be? What would you say the most important things to think about? Anyone can jump in.
I think mine is probably obvious. You know, if you try something and you realize that that might not be what's most effective for your employers, don't be afraid to change and try something different. This definitely is much more effective in a lot of ways for us here in Alabama.
I think for Colorado is really what I spoke to already, is that collaboration and the coordination with your Department of Revenue and your apprenticeship team. Whoever is at the table that needs to be at the table should be at the table from start to finish, so that you have a clear process, just a clear process for us.
The only thing I'll add, and I think it probably is apparent from my previous comments, but just be very thoughtful when you're drafting the language for any legislation. It's nice that you can use it to focus on specific industries and populations, but as we found out, that sometimes results in unintended consequences. And the more differentiation that you have in the legislation, the more difficult it's going to be to determine the amount of credit that the company's eligible for, which means more work involved for everyone, particularly the company.
That's a very good point. So don't be afraid to change direction if it's not working. Partnerships from the start. And if I was to paraphrase what you just said, Amanda, I think simplicity is king. Keep it straightforward. Brilliant. I'm gonna open this up to the audience. So please either put any questions in the sidebar or put your hand up and I'll bring you in. I'm gonna start with a couple of questions in the sidebar. There was a bit of a discussion earlier. I'm gonna come to you first, Tracy, on this, but welcome everyone's points about who's actually eligible for tax credits. So it's our understanding that Colorado excludes nonprofits. A school district wouldn't be able to, they don't have the right tax status to claim this. So yeah, I wonder, Tracy, if you could talk a bit about how Colorado's thinking about incentives for those sorts of employers, your nonprofits or your public sector employers that don't necessarily have any kind of tax liability.
Yeah, I wouldn't really be able to speak to that too much about why the nonprofits were taken out of there. So I don't want to overextend and answer that question improperly. So I do know that we really want to make sure that those smaller employers are receiving the tax credits for in those new and emerging industries. And I have received a lot of questions for that with our with the nonprofits and with the government entities as well. But I mean, really just making sure that you're paying taxes within Colorado, this is a refundable tax credit. So it comes out of taxes. So paying taxes is a big reason why you would want to.
That
Would
makes
be.
sense. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of a design issue, right? In tax credits
Yeah.
overall, there's just bits of the labor market that you're not going to be able to hit. Meredith, I wonder if in your switch to a reimbursement model, have you brought in types of employers that previously you wouldn't have seen?
Probably.
Yeah.
I can't say for sure, but I would imagine. Yeah, because I do, like we talked about earlier, I think sometimes it brings people to the table that you weren't already talking to.
Brilliant. I'm going to pick up a question from Rick in the sidebar, which is what are the implications of this for a national strategy like the Skill Act? So, Rick, I'm assuming you mean like what are the implications for state credits if you had a really big yeah, federal tax credit?
Actually, that's not what I was thinking. I was thinking more like these are, except for Colorado, these are sounding like they're almost too big to take on, or they need a lot of tuning. Whereas the Skill Act seems to be just a one size fits all tax credit across states at the federal level, where nobody's completely exempted, but obviously companies have their own arrangements. And I'm just trying to understand from this conversation whether that's a good idea because they're looking to put like $500 million into it. And so there's a lot of funding and it would be done to all states at the level of, proportional to the population of the state. But I just don't, I want to know if it's a win or if it's just going to be subject to a lot of the things that have been not working out so far.
That is correct. That makes sense. I can give an AFA perspective on that, and then anyone else feel free to jump in. I think the first thing I'd say is, an extra $500 million in apprenticeship would be great. That's by no means what is needed for like a scaled and functioning system. So I wouldn't necessarily see that as an upper cap. I think if we were sort of remotely operating on the kind of scale that we could be operating, we're talking multiple billions of dollars in public funding. I think the second thing I'd say is it would be great to have a significant tax credit like that. It only solves part of the problem for part of the labor market. That will help incentivize some employers to, come into apprenticeship or expand programs, but that's not necessarily a sustainable way to fund a system. So I definitely think about that as like tax credits can be part of a whole. Like employer incentivization is one of the things we need funding for, not everything. Um, Anyone else? I think Jim's coming in to share some reflections.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, more on the political side, so it's a little off topic, but the thing about tax credits, and we had one in Maryland. I'm a state senator in Maryland, in addition to being on the A4A board. We had one for a couple of years, and it didn't work, and I could bore you with why it didn't work, but we let it expire, and we've moved to a grant pay per apprentice program, which we just launched this year after doing some pilots with federal money. But I want to make this political point as we think about this issue going forward is a tax credit. The reason there are all these states with tax credits, the reason we had one in Maryland and got rid of it, is it's easier for policymakers to understand than a grant program. And we have tax credits for all kinds of other things, number one. And number two, people don't like paying taxes. And so saying you're going to lower their taxes has inherent political traction. And so I just think as we go forward, that's why I think this report and this webinar is really important to figure out, is there a way, based on everyone's experience, we can design a tax credit that will actually work. I'm very encouraged by Senator Young and Congressman Moran's bill, because here you have serious players on the Republican side, which is important because they're proposing putting serious money into it. Um, uh, I think there's something here that as we go forward, we need to figure out, is there a model that we can get the federal government to do?
Thanks, Jim. That's very helpful. Um, Rick, I think there's a lot more to discuss here. I'm not sure if we fully answered your question, but it's worth.
No, that's
it's
fine for
worth
now.
reviewing.
Mainly I just wanted to know, I mean, I'm right near Licardo's district, who's really pushing this thing, and I'm just curious if there's something I should just be raw behind it, or suggesting some changes, or getting you guys together.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, let's continue the conversation. I want to pick up on another couple of questions in the chat. Jeremy has asked a few questions. Firstly, curious whether Alabama's experience resonates with South Carolina, Colorado. The switch from tax to grants. The question is, are grant reimbursements better than tax credits for simplicity and participation? When we've got businesses with low tax liability, nonprofits, etc. I wonder, Tracy, Amanda, if you've got any reflections on that. You obviously have there's other grants and incentives in your states as well. So I wonder whether, you've got any sense of the comparison between them. Is it just easier to go with a reimbursement model or a grant incentive?
From South Carolina's perspective, I would say we're definitely exploring that pay for performance model. And it's hard to say because each design is going to have pros and cons. There are going to be people who are eligible. There's going to be people who are not eligible in each one. And to your point, Harry, we do have other funding sources and funding availability for companies who have registered apprenticeships. So there are other grants, there are other tax incentives that are different for these types of programs as well. So this isn't South Carolina's only incentive, which I think makes it perhaps a little less enticing for us to change it or do away with it, because it has been beneficial in a lot of respects, but always looking to see how can we make it better, easier for those stakeholders involved.
Yeah, I would say it's a little too early to tell for us. We're just excited to have a tax credit to begin with. So I don't necessarily think that we're looking at changes. We're looking at what we can fine tune with the process that we have in place currently and see if there is any adaptations that need to happen in the future. And I don't think that we are closed-minded to where we're stuck on this track. And if it isn't working, Meredith, I think that what you said earlier is don't be afraid to make the change. So I think that's always up for discussion. But right now, we're just happy with what we're doing.
Brilliant. Thanks, both. And I want to pick up, there's a second part to Jeremy's question, which I think is back to you, Amanda, which is whether you've got a sense yet of how that retention part of the payment is working, splitting it into an upfront payment and then a longer term retention completion payment. Is that helping? It's probably too early to tell, I think, is the answer. But yeah, any kind of anecdotal reflections?
It is a little early, although I will say that because that is an added component, is something that companies have not been able to take advantage of previously. At the same time, that data piece is critically important because the way that we receive data on the apprenticeship tax credits right now does not and would not distinguish for us how much of that is from the retention credit versus youth versus adult active apprentices. So that's going to be critically important for us to be able to determine, but I do expect it's only going to increase the claims and increase the amount that's claimed because it's completely new.
That's Amanda. Yeah, that definitely matches our understanding. Like whenever we've been in conversations about designing pay for apprenticeship funds, I think we've always advised for having some kind of retention or completion part of that payment. The logic to it is pretty solid. I don't think there's really thorough evaluations of it because, as you say, the data's just not really there, but the logic makes sense. We've got one more question in the sidebar, which is, I'm just trying to find it. Are there different approaches for different industries? For example, any special suggestions for healthcare apprenticeships? I think there's also been some discussion about the kind of education side of this. So yeah, really interested in any of your reflections on, are there particular industries where you need to take a different approach when you're thinking about tax incentives?
Ours is uniform across the board.
With a reimbursement model. So that's it's kind of another argument for the simplicity of that. Tracy, Amanda, any reflections on particular industries?
Yeah, I just think for us, it's the same for all of the new and emerging industries. So just, yeah, it really is uniform across the board for those eligible occupations.
Yeah, in South Carolina, we don't distinguish between industries or incentivize certain industries over others, but it certainly could come down to the types of businesses that maybe don't have as much of a tax burden as Meredith was mentioning earlier. So for sure. But in those situations, if the tax credit is not advantageous to a particular organization, we just sort of, steer away from that part of the conversation when we're talking about benefits and speak to more of the other funding opportunities that are available to offset costs.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm afraid that's just about brought us to time. So I want to wrap up by thanking our panel for sharing all of your expertise. So I think being clear in this conversation, this is an area where there's a lot going on, but we don't really have like strong evaluation or a sense of exactly what we should be doing. As Jim said, it's a really politically salient area. So it's really great to have, the more kind of what's your real life experience of what works and what doesn't to inform all of that political interest. So yeah, thank you for coming and sharing. And thanks everyone for coming. Our next webinar is going to be in about 2 weeks' time. You can find all the details on our website. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you,
Everyone.